Okay, Bore da Croeso, good morning and welcome to our monthly knowledge share webinar. I'm Rhiannon Lawson, Head of Standards for CDPS. Today we've got a really great lineup of speakers who will be covering digital accessibility in both a UK-wide government context and a local Welsh government context as well. In terms of housekeeping, we'll have simultaneous translation. Simultaneous translation is not available today. However, if you're a Welsh speaker, feel free to post comments and questions in the chat in Welsh. We've got someone on hand to translate that for us. Questions will be answered at the end, and you can post questions either in the Q&A or in the chat. The schedule's quite tight, but we'll try and answer as many as we can. And if we don't get to your questions, then we will make sure to come back to you via email. I'd like to hand over, first of all, I'm just going to tell you a tiny bit about CDPS for those who don't know about CDPS. So we work alongside other organisations to create public services founded upon the needs of people who use them. And we bring Welsh public service professionals and digital experts together to do that. We also have the Welsh Digital Service Standard that I lead alongside soon some guidance to explain how to use those standards. So I'd like to hand over to Richard Morton and Amanda Diamond from the Central Digital and Data Office at gov.uk in the UK government. Over to you.
Thank you, Rhiannon. Good morning, everyone. I hope you can see me, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn my camera off while I'm presenting because I'm having a few connection issues this morning, typically. But just wanted to say thank you very much for inviting us along today to talk to you. My name is Amanda Diamond, and I'm Head of Content for Transforming Government Services within the Central Digital and Data Office. And before that, I was Head of Content for the Government Digital Service, where I also led the cross-government content community, most of whom create and publish content for the gov.uk website or on government services.
And I'm Richard Morton, Head of Accessibility for Government at the Central Digital and Data Office. And I work with Amanda in the same team now in Transforming Government Services. So over to you, Amanda.
Great, thank you. Okay, here's what we're going to be talking to you about today. I'll be talking about why we design content the way we do. I'll talk about some of the research behind this and why it's so important to write in plain language.
And then I'll be talking to you about the legal requirements around accessibility and some tips and hints on how to make your content accessible or more accessible.
Okay, first up, why do we design content the way we do on gov.uk? Well, if you mention accessibility to people, often their first thought will be screen readers or assistive technology. But designing content in the right way can make a huge difference to your audience, whether they use screen readers or not, and whether they have an impairment or not. Now, I'm sure everyone is already well aware of this, but it's always worth reminding ourselves that how we read in a digital environment is very different to how we read print products like magazines, documents, books, etc. But how do we know this for sure? Well, we know this from extensive eye tracking research. Now, research from the Nielsen-Norman Group, who are world leaders in experience and interaction research, found that users typically read in an F-shaped pattern online, as you can see in these first two heat maps on your screen. But that's not the only pattern. There's also an E-shaped pattern, which is on the far right. And there are a few other variations to boot, but the F-shape is the most widely observed. With all these patterns, what they have in common is this scanning behavior. Users tend to scan a page looking for the information they need rather than reading every single word or reading all the information in detail. Then, when they see something of interest or something that's useful to them, they go back and linger on that information and read across the sentence in more detail. And of course, scanning is not the only user behavior that we see. Scrolling is another common behavior that we observe. And scrolling is most common on smartphones and handheld devices, although it does happen on desktop too, but to a lesser extent. And despite this scrolling behavior, studies still show that most of a user's viewing time is concentrated towards the top of the page, probably because that's where most of the anchor points and navigational elements and orientation points tend to be. And despite the fact that we scroll even through quite long pages, Nielsen research has also found that time and time again, people typically read less than 30% of an average web page. And so it's because of all of this observed user behavior that we structure our content in the way that we do. We chuck it up into sections to make it easier for people to scan and to scroll. And where it makes sense to do so, we break content up into different pages to make pages much shorter so that it's easier for users to navigate and absorb. And interestingly, the page on the right of your screen has exactly the same content as the page on the left. And although it looks shorter, it's much harder to read because it's just a wall of text. The content hasn't been designed, so it hasn't been broken up or clearly structured into easily digestible sections, which makes it off-putting for the reader and much harder to read. So when we're structuring our content, it's really important that we use the correct headings and subheadings. And many of us are guilty, I am certainly, of simply changing the font size or making things bold to create subheaders, but these things are not very well understood by screen readers. So using the correct page structures to format your content help those people who use screen readers to understand the layout of a document. And each document or page should have a single page heading, which is a H1, and then subheadings such as H2s and H3s should then be used to provide subsequent page structure. And when we're writing our content, it's also important that we consider the cognitive load that we're placing on our audience. So long sentences can be complicated and confusing and can place an unnecessary cognitive burden on our readers. It's much easier for people to comprehend short, simple words and plain language, which is why we generally write for a reading comprehension age of 9 years old. And this helps our content reach the most users possible. It also makes our content much easier to scan, which is why we try to stick to 25 words per sentence. And not only is this easier to read at a glance, it's also easy for someone to say in a single breath, which is especially useful for screen readers. And as I've shown, walls of text can be tricky to read, especially on mobile phone, and can often be off-putting to people, which is why our guidance is to use no more than 5 lines per paragraph. And of course, it's also important to use a sensible font size. I wear glasses, lots of people do. Why should we be captive the touch of the tiny font size and strain our eyes? It just makes things more difficult to people, for people to read. So it's important to use a sensible size. And of course, it's not just about how we structure our content or the size of the font that we use. It's also important to think about how we say what we say. So the words and the language we use, these are just as important for our users. Writing in plain language is absolutely vital for people to easily understand what they're saying. If we use unnecessarily complicated language, it makes things harder for people, as demonstrated by this monster of a sentence. Consequences of erudite vernacular irrespective of necessity, which also means problems with using long words needlessly. I know which sentence I prefer there. And there has been some really interesting research into people's preference for plain language, which is what I'm going to talk through now. So a number of years ago, a US law professor called Chris Trudeau wanted to understand how complex language on medical consent forms affected people's understanding and comprehension of their situation. And so he asked a few hundred people about their thoughts on legal language and legal communications as they were faced with when making medical claims. And he was interested in this because at the time, a really high number of lawsuits were being issued against US hospitals and medical centres. And what he found was that those with low levels of literacy had a high preference for clear, plain language. Okay, so no surprises there, right? So far, so predictable. But what he didn't expect to find was that people with high levels of literacy also had a preference for plain language. Even more surprising was his finding that there was an even greater preference for plain language the more educated the person actually was. And overall, the study found that 80% of participants preferred plain language. He also found that as the complexity of the information increased, so did the preference for plain language. And as you can see here, Those who had a master's or a PhD had a higher preference for plain language than those whose educational attainment was lower than a bachelor's degree. And even more interesting is that those who had a law degree had an even greater preference still for plain language, probably because their lives are full to the brim of convoluted, arcane language that they have to deal with every single day as part of their jobs. And then in a follow-up global study about plain language, participants from every major English-speaking country preferred clear and simple language. And this was in the context of using legal language in the workplace. In this global study, participants were asked 10 questions. Each question offered 2 versions of the answer. Both had the same meaning. Participants were asked which version they preferred. And so now it's time to ask you all to participate in a little bit of a quiz. I'm going to show you some options. Pop in the chat the option that you prefer. Out of the following 2, which do you think people preferred? Option 1. If this breach continues, my client will immediately terminate this contract. Or option 2. If there is a continuation of this breach, my client will effect an immediate termination of this contract. Pop in the chat what you think people preferred. Yeah, lots of people putting number 1. Absolutely. 86 preferred option 1. I'm worried about people who didn't prefer option 1 in this one, but it's easy to see why people preferred this option. It's shorter, it's clearer, and it's more direct. Okay. Out of these 2 options, which do you think people preferred? Option 1, if you don't respond, the court will issue a default judgment. That means you lose and the court will give the plaintiff what they're asking for. Or option 2, if you don't respond, the court will issue a default judgment. What do you think people preferred out of that one? People are choosing 1 or 2. Yeah, a bit of less consensus in this one. Interestingly, people preferred option 1. 78% preferred option 1, in fact, even though it's longer. But people appreciated having technical terms explained to them, even if it actually made the text a bit longer. In this option, you can see that the second sentence makes the first one clearer, so it improves comprehension. And it's worth noting that in the study, people preferred the longer option for only 2 of the 10 questions. 8 out of 10 questions, people preferred the shorter option. So brevity, as long as the information is understandable, was still people's preferred choice. Now, working in government, our content has to be accessible to all. So we have to make sure our content is available and understandable to everyone, regardless of whether or not they have a visual, hearing, speech, motor, or cognitive impairment. 360,000 people in the UK have a visual impairment, which means they may need to use assistive technology to read our content. 7.3 million adults in the UK are dyslexic, which means they may face certain challenges related to reading and comprehending static text on a web page. And 1 in 6 adults have poor literacy skills. So it's important that we cater for all of these needs when we create our content. But it's also worth remembering that impairments aren't always permanent. People can sometimes lose the use of 1 or more of their senses temporarily. This can be due to an illness or injury, such as having an ear infection or a burst eardrum or a cold, or it could be due to a particular situation, like holding a baby or being in a noisy environment that prevents you from being able to hear clearly. So we have to consider the needs of our audience, whether the disability or impairment is permanent, temporary, or situational. And to that end, there are 4 principles of accessibility. Information and websites must be perceivable, understandable, operable, and robust. And in practice, that means that in order for people to successfully complete a transaction, whether that's completing a form or just getting the information they need, these 4 things need to be in place. If any one of these fails, the transaction fails. So in order for something to be perceivable, people need to be able to get the information through 1 or more of their senses of sight, hearing, or touch. For something to be understandable, the content, the instructions, navigation, all of this needs to be understood by users. So complex language, complicated sentence structures, and jargon are all barriers to people understanding your content. And for something to be operable, everyone must have the means to complete any action. So from opening a web page, acting on a link, operating a button, filling in a form, all of these things need to be available by more than a single means. And then finally, for something to be robust, it needs to be able to work on a combination of different operating systems and browsers and assistive technologies, and not just the latest version of these. So I've talked a lot. I'm now going to hand over to Richard, who's going to talk to you more about accessibility and the law.
Thanks, Amanda. You just dropped out a bit there. So the four things there were perceivable, understandable, operable, and robust. I mean, you did explain those, but in the initial bit, it just dropped out a bit. So yeah, I'm going to talk a bit more about accessibility in the law. Accessibility isn't something new for the UK government. It's built into our design systems and ways of working and standards. But making online services accessible isn't just something we're passionate about. It is also the law. So first of all, the Equality Act 2010, as it says, reads, "We have a legal obligation to provide equal access to people with disabilities." In the Equality Act, it says that public organisations and authorities must comply with the public sector equality duty. And this means that public organisations like central local government, healthcare and education must think about the needs of people who are disadvantaged or suffer inequality when they make decisions about how they provide their services and implement policies. And that applies just as much in the sort of digital sphere as in the physical sphere. More recently, we have the Public Sector Bodies, Websites and Mobile Applications Accessibility Regulations 2018. And they mean that most public sector organisations have a legal obligation to make their websites and mobile apps accessible to people with disabilities. They need to meet the latest version of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, also known as WCAG, version 2.1 to level AA. They need to make sure their websites and apps and documents are perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust in the way that Amanda explained earlier. And they need to publish an accessibility statement, and this will make clear the level of accessibility across the site or app, and also allows people to make complaints or to contact the enforcement bodies. So now, just covering the regulations briefly, I just want to go into some specific hints and tips to help make content accessible. First of all, link text. Link text is the text that describes a link to a page or document. And there are some simple things you can do to make them accessible or make them more accessible. Link text should be meaningful and it should make sense without the context of surrounding content. This is to make sure it's accessible to users navigating the content with a keyboard instead of a mouse. And also, more importantly, possibly for those using screen readers. And that's because screen reader users sometimes pull down a list of links and access them from there. So they might see a list of links that just say, read more or click here, that sort of thing. To meet this content, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines standards, you must make sure that links stand out from other text or the body text, ideally by underlining them and making the colour significantly different, but you can do it in different ways. In terms of colour selection, if you're going to use a colour to make text different, you need to make sure there's enough colour contrast ratio between the link text and the body text if they aren't distinguished in another way. And that's quite tricky to do. So you often see blue links and black body text, but to distinguish them from each other is quite difficult for some people. As a general rule, if you're asking people to do something, start with a verb for the link text. And if you're linking to information, link directly over the text that describes the information. So in these examples, if you're telling people to do something, start with a verb. So apply for a passport is the whole of the link text. And if you're linking to information, link directly over the text. So find out about types of election. So types of election is the link text in that example. Here are some common examples of good, bad, and ugly link text I'm sure you've all come across. So good, read guidance on applying for a driving license. Pretty clear what that means. Bad, read more. As I said, if you're using a screen reader, you might get a list of links. It's also cognitively difficult for some people to understand, you know, at the end of a sentence or something that read more is about that information. And then ugly, click. It's just a bit sort of unhelpful. It doesn't really help these days as well because most people are using accessing things through touchscreen mobile devices. I think more than 60% of access to Gov.uk, for example, is through mobile devices. So we have to make sure that's taken into account. Okay, so what about documents? In particular, the infamous PDF. There's a lot of discussion around PDFs and their accessibility. These documents are really created to be printed and designed in that way. So they're not really built to be read on screens. This means they aren't generally responsive to changes in screen sizes, which can make them challenging to open on mobile devices, and means they often aren't compatible with screen magnification and things like that. They often aren't structured either, so they can be difficult for screen reader users to navigate. On a standard web page, headings have semantic code that says this is a heading. You can do that within a PDF, but by default, it doesn't happen. And so there are a lot of PDFs that are very difficult for people to read using screen reader. There is a good post on this on the GDS blog, and we can share that link later. Okay, let's talk about something different now. Let's talk about color. Here's an example. So there's an example on screen which says press the red button to continue, press the red button to stop, or the green button to continue. And this could be part of a service, a digital service. So what do you think about this? Tell me in the chat if you think it's accessible or not. So it says press the red button to stop or the green button to continue. And there's two buttons, one red and one green. And there's no's and nopes, not accessible, coming in very quickly here. Terrible. Seems can see color. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, so yeah, colorblind, yeah. So the answer is it isn't accessible because it relies on someone being able to see the buttons, first of all, and B, it relies on being able to distinguish between the red and the green. If we change that to a grey version, so for someone who's completely colorblind, it could look like this, the same, but the buttons are in grayscale. And although it's not obvious, there is a slight difference between those two greys, but it's hard to tell. That's extremely rare for full colorblindness. But colour vision deficiency, or commonly known as colourblindness, is fairly common, and it affects about 8% of women and about 8% of men and about 0.5% of women. And in ratios, that's 1 in 12 men or 1 in 200 women. So that's quite a large number of people in the population. Okay, here's a change to that example then. How about now? Is this accessible if you add the words stop and continue to the original coloured buttons like this? More accessible, better, more, yes, better, better. Still not ideal, but it's better. Is it labeled? Yeah, good, depends on HTML. Yeah, just talking in terms of color, yes, it's more accessible. Yes, there are other things that can help from an accessibility point of view that one or two we've hinted about the HTML code, that labels have to be associated with buttons and things like that, or buttons have to have accessible names which can be picked up by screen readers. And then finally, the version of this with grayscale, but with the text on the button saying stop and continue. So yes, this is accessible with or without the color. So as long as you've got the text and the buttons, it's accessible. It's a bit confusing now because it says press the red button to stop or the green button to continue, but at least the information is there in text form. It's fine to use color. No one's saying all websites or documents should be grey or black and white. It's fine to use color to add emphasis, and design doesn't just have to be simple black and white. Okay, another aspect of color is what's known as color contrast. Now, I mentioned that in terms of contrast between links and body text. And this is generally, when I'm talking about contrast, it's between the text and its background. So if you've got black text on a white background, or black text on a grey background, or it could be other things like buttons, navigation, or controls and their backgrounds. How clearly distinguished from the background is that red button or that green button? So here's an example of color contrast that isn't good, and it fails the Web Content Accessibility Guideline standard. It's orange text on a white background and the reverse, so white text on an orange background. And these color combinations have a low color contrast, making it difficult to read the content. Maybe at this size you can read it. In the sort of notes view, I can't read it, it's quite small. So particularly at smaller font sizes. Also particularly bad if someone's looking at this in natural light, if you're down on the beach doing this work, or imagine trying to read this on a mobile phone. It's quite difficult generally on a mobile phone if it's this small and low contrast. Here's an example of a better, fairly good color contrast. So the green background with white text has a contrast ratio which is slightly above the recommended minimum of 4.5 to 1. So that's better. Higher contrast is generally better, but always best to avoid going to the extreme of black against white wherever possible. And the reason for that is that can cause difficulties for some dyslexic people. It can be too extreme. There are freely available tools for checking color contrast. Some are online and some are downloadable. This one was created by former members of GDS, and it's free. It's freely available. It's on Glitch, and it indicates that these combinations on the screen pass the requirements of Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and they actually pass at a higher level, AAA, than the legal requirement, which is AA. So it gives you an indication that you're doing the right thing. Okay, I'm going to talk a bit about images and video and how to make them more accessible. First, let's talk about alt text or alternative text. You've probably heard of this. Alt is just short for alternative. It's called alt text because the attribute in HTML is alt, but it seems to become in fairly common usage. Anyway, alt text is used to describe an image, and it's read by software, screen reader software for visually impaired users. And it also displays when an image doesn't load. So it's actually quite useful if you have connection problems, things like that. You can see the name, not just the name of the image, but the alternative text. So in the chat, see if you can tell me what you think would make good alt text for this image. Pancake in a snowstorm. Oh, brilliant. Very poetic. I like that. Powdered sugar being sprinkled over a stack of pancakes. Photo of a stack of pancakes with blueberry sugar and syrup. Sugar. Depends on if it's decorative or illustrative. Good point. Things that make Jonathan hungry. That's a good alt text, isn't it? Bit specific, but very good. Stack of blueberry pancakes. Yeah, so all good, interesting answers. And I guess what we'd say is that an example of a simple alt text description for this image could be just pancakes, or perhaps stack of pancakes. Unless there's a need to provide a detailed description of the image, it's not always necessary to include lengthy alt descriptions. But that said, it's also important to remember that images can also convey feelings, including trust and authority, and in the case of Jonathan, clearly hunger. For example, if the piece was about the importance of balanced school meals, the blueberries would hold greater significance, so should probably be mentioned. It's important to use your judgment to determine what information is necessary to provide users with the same experience of the content. Context is important as well. You know, if the image was in a different context, you might have different alt text. So say it was from the Great British Bake Off, you might need more description. That would be more appropriate. So to summarize around alt text, it's important you keep it short and simple, including only the information the user needs to know about the message the image is conveying, wherever possible. It's difficult to get the balance right. So you shouldn't include things like picture of or image of. You might be doing it to try and be helpful, but actually that's unhelpful because screen reader software usually tells the user it's an image or a picture. So that ends up with duplication. You get picture of and stuff like that. It's also important you add alt text to other design elements like buttons when creating marketing emails, for example. Moving on to animations and animated GIFs and video. Video description should be available for all videos without audio or with limited audio, and it doesn't need to be complex. Body of text should use plain English to describe the key visual elements in the video to users who cannot watch the video's content or can't see it. It's easy to miss things like showing someone's name and job title on the screen, but it isn't spoken out. So make sure you include a voiceover. And it's something quite common on social media is videos with subtitles but no voiceover. Also important to avoid flashing content. Flashing images can cause seizures and can do it quite quickly. So the requirement from the guidelines is don't have flashes more than 3 times a second. If you have to have flashing content, then do make sure you warn people about it in advance. Going on to subtitles and captions. Majority of video content is now viewed without audio. So these things like Facebook and other social media platforms. And we've had questions about which sort of subtitles and captions are best to use. If you're not sure on the difference, open captions, otherwise known as subtitles, are generally part of the video, so they can't be switched off, whereas closed captions are optional and can therefore be turned on or off. Closed captions can be better because they're more flexible, but it depends on the situation. When you create captions, try and use an accessible font, a simple font, make sure the text is large enough, make sure there's good color contrast as well. So avoid, just jazzy combos of colors, but stick with the defaults preferably. Talked a lot about websites and things like that, but it's not just about those. Think about other things as well. Surveys, social media posts, emails, job adverts, are they all accessible? You need to think about them all. So in summary, briefly, we design content to make it accessible to everyone. People read less than 30% of an average web page. People tend to read in an F-shaped pattern online, scanning and scrolling through the content. People prefer plain language, and those with higher educational attainment have a greater preference for plain language. And impairments can be situational and temporary as well as permanent. And it's important to note that doesn't mean you have to do things differently. You just have to take into account that these things can be temporary or situational. So all this means that our information is accessible. It makes sure it's available for everyone. And that's all our users, especially the most vulnerable. It's also worth noting that most of this stuff isn't difficult to do. It just takes a bit of thought, consideration, planning, and building a culture of accessibility. So thanks very much from myself and Amanda.
Thank you very, very much. We didn't do a practice round of applause at the beginning, and I'm sorry about that. So if anyone wants to unmute and give a little round of applause to Amanda and Richard, thank you very much. I've been keeping an eye amongst the yeses and nos and various other things. I haven't seen any questions yet, but if anyone has any questions for the end, please let me know. I particularly like the bit about language of higher educated people and busy people. I remember that being a thing around ministers in particular. They don't want reams and reams of long words. And I also remember that the BBC they changed the way they presented their football scores, because the wins and losses used to only be in red and green. It didn't say win or loss. So I think it's in the last few years they put a W over the green and an L over the red to show that. So thank you very, very much. And now I've lost my order. Now I think I'm handing over to Emma. Is that right?
Yeah, thank you.
Wonderful. I think Amanda and Richard, are you still controlling the slides? Fabulous. Over to you.
Great, thank you. Diolch, Amanda, Richard, Bore pawb. I'm Emma Willis. I'm a content designer in the Welsh Local Government Association. Richard, if you could move on to the next slide, please. Thanks. As was already covered in that great presentation, there's of course a legal need for accessibility in government and of course in local government. And most authorities we see are good at adhering to this in terms of standards, checklists, assessments. It's well known and it's well followed. We've also seen, however, that accessibility has to draw on softer skills to really make content accessible to everyone. So understanding what content citizens need access to, how they're accessing the content. You can see on this slide, people might be on mobile devices, they might be on the move, they might need some help getting to complete the tasks they need to online. There might be differing levels of digital literacy. And I was actually hosting a local government service design community of practice yesterday, looking specifically at content design and accessibility. And this challenge of the softer side of things came up a few times, and particularly around getting this kind of understanding and this user-centered design embedded across maybe less digital or non-digital roles, and building the culture and mindset that's really needed to affect change. Can you move to the next slide, please? Thanks. Another area that came up was PDFs, which I'll just touch on really briefly as Richard covered this. It's a real area of focus in local authorities, as a lot of activities produce PDF outputs for various reasons. You can see here, there's council reports, there's meeting minutes, so things like agendas, planning documentation. And this means it's a huge job to fix. And while there's an obligation to publish and there's a need to make it accessible, user demand for these pieces and the value and the benefit, it can often be unknown. So the value of doing this huge amount of work needs to be interrogated and prioritized realistically. Legacy systems and processes can also cause barriers as not a one-size-fits-all solution, so it requires a bit of planning. It is an ongoing conversation though, and it has to be, because as was covered, PDFs are not very accessible, particularly on mobile, which we're seeing rising use of. And we also have an article from the WLGA digital team about PDF accessibility, which I can put in the chat after this. If you can move on to the next one, please, Richard. And going back to the theme of embedding accessibility really into local authorities, this is made more complex by the sheer amount of services we're talking about. It's between 800 and 1400 per authority. And as you can see here, it covers everything from housing and schools, adult social care, bins, leisure centres, anything you can think of basically is being covered. And so the lack of capacity when faced with managing all these services, combined with often a reactive delivery, makes it easier for accessibility issues to be missed, while teams kind of having to work in silos by necessity makes it difficult to ensure consistency across services and also across authorities. And there is a bright side though, it's not just all challenges. I've seen kind of personally the huge desire that there is among local authorities to do accessibility right and to think about it from the start and to bring teams along on the journey and the whole organisation. And there's some great work being done. And it's something that we're trying to help with at the WLGA digital team in a number of ways. You can see here, this is the Life Events Service Design Project, which is a big thing we're working on at the moment, which seeks to link up different services that a citizen may need and interact with at a particular time in their lives and build these services around their needs and their journey. And as well as this kind of direct name, we're also hoping to use the project to shape a blueprint for delivery that builds in the right activities for local authorities to take away and build upon themselves so that they can consistently deliver usable and accessible services. We're just wrapping up the discovery phase of this project, and you can see here some of the activities we've already embarked on. So the top section there is a part of an affinity diagramming workshop based on user interviews to really understand their constraints and their needs when they're interacting with services. And below that is a cognitive walkthrough, which had a dedicated accessibility reviewer looking at current issues and where we can make improvements. Next slide, please, Richard. Thank you. We're also really focused on building capability through a number of different activities, including learning frameworks, which will target different digital roles, but they will all have accessibility as a foundational skill to make sure that everybody is working from that perspective. Recruitment is another area we hear a lot about, recruiting people with the right digital skills. So there's activities to get those digital skills brought in and also get people upskilled. And finally, the community of practice I've already mentioned is absolutely crucial in everything we do, because how we help authorities has to work for them. So we're really driven by their feedback and their ideas, and sessions like this are also really useful to see what other people are doing, share good practice, and find out what people want to hear about. And if you could just move on to my final slide, please, Richard. If you do want to stay up to date with anything we're doing, you can visit our website where we blog, and there's also a link to sign up to our mailing list. It's walesLocalGovernment.digital. You can email the team. You can connect with me directly on Twitter, and if there is time at the end, I'm happy to answer questions or pick up questions after this session. And I think I'm just about at the end of my time. I don't know how I did for my 5 minutes.
That was perfect. Perfect.
So thank you very much for listening, Diolch.
Thank you very much. And we do have some questions, but I'm gonna hand over to Dewi, and then we'll do all the questions at the end. So Dewi, over to you.
Thank you, Rhiannon, and slides magically came up. Wonderful, seamless. Hiya, my name is Dewi Smith. I work on the Digital Communities Wales programme. Digital Communities Wales is a Welsh government funded programme. We exist to reduce digital exclusion in Wales, and we want a Wales where everyone has the skills, access and motivation to be confident users of digital technology. In my 5 minutes, 4.5 minutes now, I'm going to talk a little bit about accessibility and the Welsh language. And I think, obviously most of the main kind of accessibility points were covered by Richard and Amanda in that excellent presentation there. So mine's really just setting a little bit of context and hopefully pointing you in the direction of some useful tools and resources and some developments around various bits of technology. So the Welsh language is growing. In the last census, over 20% of people in Wales said they spoke it, and over 28% of people said they understood it. And the Welsh government has a target of 1 million Welsh speakers by 2050, which is about 33% of the population. Couple of stats from the Welsh Language Commissioner's Office. So 94% of Welsh speakers feel that providing Welsh language service helps a company make a good impression. 75% of Welsh speakers believe that charities should operate bilingually in Wales, and 86% of the population in Wales feel that the Welsh language is something to be proud of. So this means there's lots of people who want to access services through Welsh. The Welsh Language Measure 2011 is the legislation that created the Welsh Language Standards. The Welsh Language Standards promote and facilitate the Welsh language and ensure that the Welsh language is not treated less favourably than the English language in Wales. The standards are a set of legally binding requirements that aim to improve the bilingual service that the people of Wales can expect to receive from a number of public and statutory bodies. So I think that would probably apply to a lot of the people attending today, obviously government, health boards, etc. There is a statutory requirement there. I've got a list of some useful tools there. I think Gemma will probably pop a couple of links up in the chat. I think one of the main places to go is the Hello Blood website. So some of these things will be applicable to you. Some of these things you might not be able to access if you work in local government, but you would be able to access if you work for a charity or a business, for instance. But Hello Blood offer a translation service to organisations in Wales. That's up to 500 words in Welsh per month, completely free of charge. They'll turn it around in 4 working days. Again, you could also have a crack at writing the copy yourself and sending it through for them to have a bit of a proofread. Again, they could turn that around within 4 working days, and there's a 1,000-word limit on that. As I said, there are some limitations on who can access that service, but for the most part, it's pretty open. I think it's a really, really useful resource, particularly, you know, to kind of build that confidence in producing content in Welsh. If you go on the Hello Blood website, there's a load of links to various bits of technology that have been developed with the Welsh language in mind. So there's various kind of interfaces for Microsoft 365, Word, where you could do your authoring, your proofreading through the medium of Welsh. You could actually have the whole interface and all the various buttons in Welsh as well. If you wish to, there's links to other offers as well. So not necessarily Microsoft. There's things like LibreOffice, which can be operated through the medium of Welsh. There's lots of stuff on creating content and support around kind of spell checkers and different places where you can go for different terms in terms of Welsh language. I use the Cwestiynau website myself quite frequently. Again, with regard to Cwestiynau, it's freely available to schools and organisations with 10 employees or fewer. But like I said, there is a website as well that you can access, and you can just do your Welsh spell checking in there. Realise I'm running out of time, but there was just one point, and I think it's kind of quite relevant to this in terms of accessibility, and that's specifically around speech resources, which would relate to screen readers and other things which, you know, significantly support and help with accessibility. So the National Language Technologies Portal is provided by the Language Technologies Unit at Bangor University, and the portal aims to be a one-stop shop, providing information and relevant resources on all things to do with speech resources. So yeah, it includes lots of language technology essentially is any activity where computers and an electronic device engage with human languages. So this can include speech recognition, text to speech, and machine translation as well. So the unit there at Bangor University are doing lots of work on that. They have created Maxen, which is an open source Welsh language voice assistant similar to Alexa or the Google Assistant. It's open source, which means that anyone can see, adapt and distribute its code as they wish. and it works as an app for phones, tablets. It's available for iOS and Android devices, and you can speak in Welsh to Maxen and ask it to do various tasks or ask for information, as you would do with an Alexa assistant as well. Last point I want to get to, and I realize I've been rushing through this a little bit, I would encourage you to go and have a look at the Hello Blog website. There's links through to all these various places from there, and you can kind of go down a bit of a rabbit hole there and explore all the various things that are available. There's one tab in there which looks specifically at user experience, and they've developed a quick and easy toolkit on bilingual software for developers. And I would say this, it could probably go even wider than that as well. So it's for anyone or any organization who wants to create a great experience for users in both Welsh and English. So it might be a case of you going through a current procurement process for a service that needs to be bilingual. The document will help you consider all the things that you should be considering at the outset to ensure that the experience is as good in Welsh as it would be in English. Multilingual support is commonplace in lots of parts of the world, so it shouldn't be that difficult. Sometimes it does prove to be a little bit difficult, but I think in terms of those considerations and obviously planning at the earliest possible stage, considering the service that you're going to be delivering, as opposed to designing something in English and then just translating it all at the end, which is completely the wrong way to do it. And it's probably something that's been done for quite a number of years. And I know that Rhiannon's doing some work around that at the moment. So I'm going to stop there because I've probably run over by a couple of minutes. But yeah, please follow the links. I think we can share my contact details afterwards if anybody's got any interest. And just to touch on the point as well, obviously in terms of accessing public services, digital inclusion is a massive thing as well. Not having the confidence or skills to be able to engage with digital technology is another barrier, and obviously an area where Digital Communities Wales support as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dewi. Yes, as you say, my team and I are doing some work around Welsh language and designing services in 2 languages, and the key thing is design, as you mentioned, from the beginning with 2 languages in mind, preferably design in tandem, and certainly don't just translate it at the end. One of the main issues that we're seeing with translating at the end is sometimes the language the spirit of the content doesn't come across, and it can make it quite complicated, formal, and what I've been told is that a lot of people who would usually choose to use Welsh would switch to English because it loses quite the same meaning. So you need to interrogate the translation to make sure that if you are going to translate it, interrogate the translation to make sure it still means what you think it means. Thank you, everybody. So we've got a few questions. I'm going to go down from the top. The first one is for, I think, Richard. So we've got, if you have 2 pictures of pancakes, or assume 2 pictures of anything in the same web page, would you give them both the same alternative text, or would that be confusing for the user?
Well, that's a new question. I haven't had that one before. I think it would very much depend on the context. There's probably some difference between the pictures. Otherwise, why would you have the same picture? It'd be unlikely you'd have the same picture, but you might. No, I'd sort of distinguish them in some way, probably. Yeah,
fabulous. We had a question about what's the alternative for PDFs. Amanda, I know you've answered that in the chat, but if you just want to cover that off quickly.
Yeah, so we do advise people to use what we have on gov.uk called HTML publications, and then it's not always sort of used by people because it might take a little bit longer. So what we've been advising content teams to push back on is the fact that they're breaking the law if they're not providing an accessible version of their content. And so anecdotally, I'm hearing that by using the kind of the legal sort of lever, more people are moving away from PDFs and using HTML publications instead. As Richard alluded to, you can make PDFs more accessible. So if you do have to use PDFs, I would say use both HTML publications and PDFs, but do everything you can to make your PDF accessible. Yeah. or avoid PDFs at all costs if you can. That's what we try to.
That's my thing. Avoid PDFs. Certainly don't create new ones. I can't remember. I think, Richard, you might have a stat. I seem to remember there's a certain number, like the number of new PDFs that are produced every year. Or I'm sure you told me it at some point. I might be putting you on the spot. But it's still a huge number of PDFs that are produced when actually there are much better alternatives.
It's something like 4,000 a month in central government, 10,000 plus a month across local authorities as well. So it's massive numbers, yeah.
Yeah, huge. So spread the message, stop creating PDFs. So then the next one from Gary, is there a chance that some or all Wales policies will be produced centrally in an easy read and design format, such as the Social Care and Wellbeing Act 2014? So interestingly, with acts, so obviously acts are written in a very specific way, and that is an issue with legal folk, and I think that's a whole nother task to be tackled about how laws are written and whether we should make those more accessible. I know that I had a conversation with someone at the Welsh, like a Welsh legal agency who wanted to find a way to get acts explained better, and their solution was a chatbot, which wasn't going to do. I pushed them away from that. I don't think it was going to do what they wanted it to do. What I've suggested instead is that they provide some kind of explanation as to what the act means. When it comes to policies more generally, I don't know that answer. I think it probably depends. I imagine Welsh government policies are probably printed or published somewhere centrally. But maybe that's something that we'll have to look into generally. I think the ownership of policies and therefore where they're published and produced makes some of that a bit difficult. But I would love it if all policies were published in a much more usable and accessible format. Will you be emailing the presentations afterwards? Yes, we can do that. How would you make complex tables accessible? That's from Lubna. Richard?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. First of all, the word complex, avoid them if possible. You can make simple tables reasonably accessible. A lot of it's about the sort of visual design and everything, using good sized fonts, making it clear, making labels clear, table entries clear. Keep them simple if you can. Complex tables can be very useful though. But if you're going to access a table using a screen reader, for example, you have to move across, traverse across and down columns and rows. That can work reasonably well for a simple table. It becomes a nightmare if you're using it in a complex table. So my advice is you can't make complex tables fully accessible, but you can break them down. If you can break them down into multiple tables, if you've ever done any sort of database work, a complex table is basically a set of smaller tables joined together in various different ways. Break it down into simple tables. That's my advice. But yes, there are technical things you can do within both documents and HTML to make them more accessible to screen reader users.
And of course, I guess there's the option to, where possible, to describe what the content is, although obviously that doesn't always get it across.
Yeah.
And then I think our final question, if I've missed anyone, please do put your hand up. Any advice for managing alt text bilingually? If you're in a large organisation with many contributors to the website, the minority of whom are Welsh first speakers, there's a small translation team, what do you do? I think, Dewi, that's probably maybe one for you.
That's maybe one for me, and I might cop out a little bit. No, I would say, there's always going to be challenges around that. What I would say is I would encourage people to contact Hello Blog. They're willing and they're happy to provide advice. There is some information on the website there around alt text and stuff as well. So unfortunately, I'm gonna not be able to provide any specific advice there, but do suggest that you contact them. They are the experts in this, and they'll be able to provide you some advice.
Thank you. That's really, and it's a really interesting point. And one of the things that I'm currently writing is around how to create a multidisciplinary team, like a minimal viable team. And one of the things I'm wondering is actually whether you have to have a couple of Welsh first speakers or translators of some kind, because being in the Welsh public sector, how can we get away with not having people who can actually create our digital content in versions that are usable for everybody. Richard and Amanda, best advice for format and sharing of large reports such as annual reports, council plans on websites?
I have some views on this. My advice is, as Amanda says, make them HTML rather than documents if possible. But I always say to people, if you've got a large annual report, don't think of that as one long page of content. Break it up, make it into a mini site, a microsite or whatever. Sometimes that can be challenging from a sort of content management system point of view. But just think about how people are going to read this content. It may need some navigation. So, structure it and do it from the start rather than going from a large annual report to an HTML report. Start with the process of HTML first. Any thoughts, Amanda?
Yeah, exactly. And I was just going to add to that. It's really interesting how we frame that, large reports. This is kind of harking back to an analog era and the way we thought about content in an analog way, where we have glossy leaflet, glossy brochure that we print out, which costs loads of money, and we give to people or we send to people and then upload that to a website. Now, those two things are very different. So if there is a need to print something out that people need physically, then that's a different proposition to having information on a website. They don't do the same thing. And so I would go back to the beginning and what Richard said. What's the information you want to get across? How should you structure that information? And then create it in a HTML publication. Because I could probably with 100% surety or a lot of confidence say that most people will not be reading every single word of the annual report. They will be scanning for bits that they want to find out about, not the whole thing. So I would say take a user-centered approach to that problem and then design it based on what you think your audience needs from that information, rather than starting with the product.
And of course, the other thing is that if people are saying, but I want to print it, well, query why they want to print it, because net zero aims, sustainability, etc. We don't want to be printing off large reports. I get it that sometimes reading on paper is easier, but as Amanda said, when it comes to large reports, a lot of the time it's probably easier for them to control F and find the thing that they actually want to read about. So that's what I would be saying. And I've also got a bit of a quick anecdote before we wrap up, because I think we're done on questions. I might have one more. Someone once said to me, but this content is accessible to me. When I said, don't create it in a PDF, this is not, pictures aren't, they're not accessible, you haven't described them, various other stuff. So I think, as both Amanda and Richard said, you need to make sure this is for absolutely everybody. It's not just one person who can read it. And, just because you're lucky enough not to have an accessibility requirement at that point, doesn't mean you might not down the line or that other people don't. So very much worth remembering, keeping all those things in mind and challenging it every single time you see that there's something that isn't quite right. So thank you so much. I can see, Amanda, you're off, so thank you. If any of you have any questions, so the slides and the recording will be sent out. If you've got any questions, please do email us. I think on the slides it's got everyone's emails, but we'll also send out all of those as well as my email. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been a really, really good turnout, and it's lovely to see you all. Thank you, Richard, Dewi, and Emma, and obviously Amanda, who has left.
Thanks,
Very
everybody.
much.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thank you.
Royal.
Bye.